Okay, so next we're going to look at a sample for a V-neck with an underarm dart. So here you can see that I've started off with the bust dart in the shoulder position, and I've removed my ease from the side seam, so 1 centimetre to 0 at the waist. Now the waist is actually would be further down here. And I've removed also a bit of ease either side of the bust dart. I've closed the bust dart and I've opened it up in the underarm position, and I've shortened the point of the bust dart by 3 centimetres as well. Other things I've done which are really important is here I've slightly shaped this line here. Now this line is an empire line, so it's 6 centimetres above the waist, and that's where that line was drawn, and that's what we call an empire line. But what I've done is I've slightly shaped it here so when it meets the side seam it's a right angle. Okay, if I had that empire line continue onto the back, that needs to be a right angle at the side seam, so when those seams join they blend effortlessly. Okay, there's no dipping or there's no point, it's a straight line. Okay, so that's really important. I've done this on some card which I've laminated so you guys can use to trace around. And what we need to do is we need to cut 2, and we need to line our grain line up with either a selvage or a straight edge. I've got a straight edge here which I know has been cut on the grain because I cut it earlier that way. But for this we need to cut 2, and or another way you could word it is cutting 1 pair. So I've got my fabric folded, so I trace it once and cut once and I get 2. So what you need to do is just hold the template down nice and flat, ensuring that this is parallel to that straight edge, the centre front and the grain line. They should all be parallel. So carefully you're going to, just with a pencil, trace around that template, making sure it doesn't move. Trace in the notches here for the dart. Trace around the centre front and around that empire line. So you need to go in here to mark the notches and here to mark the bust point. There's a little hole there. Okay, so that is what your piece should look like. We've got our V-neck, we've got our underarm, our bust dart and our empire line and our centre front. We've marked our bust point and our notches for our bust dart. Now to mark that bust point on the other side, to make sure it's accurate, what I'm going to do, I'm just going to pin the 2 layers together. And I'm going to cut that out right on the line. Alright, so I've cut out my 2 pieces for my sample. I can snip my notches for my bust dart. But then, as I was saying before, we need to mark this on the other side. So what we can do is we can put a pin directly on that bust point mark, flip it over and put another pin right in where that first one went. Take your pins out and then pull apart your two pieces, and there you have your bust point on each piece. So where the pin is sticking out, what we're going to do is we're going to draw in our bust dart. So ruling from the bust point, so the pin's there, it's a great guide to the bottom notch. I'm going to rule in my stitch line and then repeat it with the top notch. That's a really good way of doing it when you first start to sew darts. When you're confident, you won't need to mark it. But to begin with, we're going to use a drawn in stitch line. Now this one should end up being a mirror image, alright, because we're working with a pair. And we're going to use one to face the other. And it'll make sense once we get started sewing what I mean by facing the other. Okay, so take that out. And you can see I now have a mirror image. So one of these is going to face the other. For our sample, we're just doing a half. So not doing a whole front, we're just doing one side. So to sew our bust dart, what we do to get it ready is we pinch it in half and we line up our notches. You see there that they're lined up. And then we pinch it at that bust point. Then we can gently finger press that. You could pin it if you wanted to, but I avoid pinning. I feel like it takes up a lot of time. And I'd rather you learn to do it the quickest way. Okay, so I've pinched it together, lined up my notches, and I've given it a finger press. Then I start at the side seam notch. Do my reverse, stitch along that stitch line. Now here's the tricky bit. I'm going to actually sew right off the end of the dart, and I'm going to keep sewing. So it's going to create stitches in the thread. Then I'm going to stop once I've got about 2 to 3 centimeters, and then I come back, making sure this isn't too tight. Should just be taut, but not like tight that's going to fold. The fabric should remain flat. And I come back on to the fold of the dart and I do a little reverse stitch there. Now the reason why we do that is we don't want that reverse stitch at the bust point, because you're going to have a big lump of thread there then. That's not ideal. So if I open it, it should be nice and flat, no big lump of thread there. So that's the other side. It's stitched pretty close to the stitch lines, which means I folded it pretty precisely. It's off by 0.5 millimeter, which is no big deal. And now what you do is just repeat that with the other side, and then I'll show you how to iron them. So I'm back at the iron. Now if your pattern making was accurate, when your bust dart is folded down, it should blend into your side seam like that. So your side seam goes straight down and the edge of your bust dart blends into that perfectly. Now when we iron bust darts, we always iron them down. We also use what we call a tailor's ham, which is this. It's a shaped like a ham, filled with sawdust, and it allows you to iron curves. So we pop that over our tailor's ham. I'm going to use the iron as an anchor here, and I'm going to pull this so I can get a nice open and well ironed dart. Then I'm going to pull it nice and tight over the curve of the tailor's ham. just gently massaging the point so it's nice and open. And then that's what your dart should look like if you've ironed it well. Okay, so there's no creases, it's nice and open, and there's no bulkiness at the point because of the technique you used. Alright, so now you can do the other side. Okay, so you can see that with the bust dart, it gives some shape to the bust area. So what you should have now is you should have two mirror image pieces with your darts sewn and ironed. So one of these pieces is going to face the other. What that means is it basically acts like a lining. But what we're going to do is we're going to stitch the top of our neckline for our V, attaching our facing, but also inserting a strap. So I'm going to use the strap from the strap sample that I made, and I'm going to cut it in half. And that cut edge is going to sit at the point. So it sits directly in the middle like that. Now I can, and I will actually, I'm going to pin that in place. So it's pinned, so it's sitting right in the middle. And then with right sides facing, so I know the right side is the good side of the dart, that's the wrong side, that's the right side, and I'm going to face those, and then I'm going to line up my V neckline. I'm not going to pin this, but what I will do is I'll pin the strap. Okay, so I'm holding it in position. I'm just going to pull out that pin from underneath and put it back in. And then I'm going to stitch along my V neckline, ensuring all my raw edges line up. So using 1 centimetre line, I'm going to stitch this with 1 centimetre seam allowance. Now I'm going to follow the shape here, and then I'm going to come back and reinforce that strap. So I'm going to keep sewing, and I'm going to sew as far as I can up to the pin before taking it out, so it keeps that strap in place. I'm using the hand wheel now. Alright, I think that's far enough. I'll take that out. Now, because you've got like a corner here you're going to have to turn, you have to estimate roughly your centimetre seam allowance. So I reckon, actually where I was, one more stitch roughly. I'm just going to check. Alright, so I reckon one more stitch wasn't quite, it was a bit more than a centimetre. That's pretty good, it lines up now. And then I can stitch the rest of the way, making sure my 2 raw edges are perfectly lined up. Now I've got the little curve that goes on the underarm. So continue to follow that around and finish with a reverse stitch. Now here is where my strap is. You can actually see through. Strap sitting perfectly in the middle. Now I want to do a reinforcing stitch that goes back and forth at this point. So the point where the strap width meets the stitch I've done, I'm going to go back and forth there to reinforce that. Okay, so I've reinforced my strap which means I should be able to turn this out, and that strap should sit perfectly at that point. What I need to do before I fully turn it out is I'm going to clip and notch the seam allowance so it does actually turn out nice and neatly. So what that means, especially around that strap area, because you've got all of this excess seam allowance that's going to try and fit into this area, I need to clip some of that away. So either side of my reinforcing stitch, I'm going to take out a section. Now make sure you don't actually clip up to the stitch line because you'll give yourself a hole. So just a couple mil shy of the stitch line, as you can see there. And along here, I'm going to clip out little triangles all the way along. When you take out some of this excess seam allowance, it allows for that shape to sit flatter once you turn it inside out. This is really important, especially when you're doing a concave curve, because all this area needs to fit into this smaller shape. When you have a straight edge, it's actually not really necessary. It's just this area here that needs to have some removed. So we'll leave the straight edge. Now we should be able to turn that inside out now. So what we're going to do now to allow that facing, so we've got the outer fabric and we've got our facing here. We want that to sit flat and we want to stop it from it rolling out once it's on the wearer. So what that means is we have to do an understitch. Now understitch is when you push the seam allowance towards the facing or the lining or whatever's on the inside of the garment. So for us, I'm going to use this side as our facing. So I'm going to push that seam allowance to that side. So back at the machine, you pop your fabric under, making sure your seam allowance is sitting all to the facing side and that your seam is nice and flat and open. And I'm going to do a stitch along here called an understitch, and that's going to hold that seam allowance in place and it's going to stop the facing from rolling out. So I'm going to line up the seam a couple millimeters past that center notch. So understitch should be relatively narrow. Now I'm not going to be able to go all the way, so I just go as far as I can, holding it nice and open and checking to make sure the seam allowance is on the right side. And it's really important that you hold it nice and open and flat. Probably only going to be able to go a few more centimeters before it gets too difficult. Do a little reverse stitch, take up lever up, and then you can move on to the other half of the V neckline. So again, I'm just manipulating that seam allowance so it's sitting towards the facing, and I'll see how far up I can get. I press a foot. Okay, that's probably about as far as I can go. Make sure it's nice and open, and you just finish your understitch on the other side. Once you're finished, you can then clip your loose threads. And then also clip your looser ends as well. Then we're going to finish by ironing it. I'll also have a couple loose threads in here as well. Make sure you get rid of them. Presenting a neat garment is really important as well for assessment. Okay, so I'm at the iron. I've pulled out my strap as far as it goes. I've got my understitch here, and I want to iron it so that I don't see, so what you should have is just a teeny tiny bit of the outer fabric showing. That way I know that the facing's not going to come out. You can also use the tailor's ham to help iron this as well, because it is a bit shaped with that dart. And you can re-iron, let's see, where is it going to fit here? Your bust dart. And that is your finished sample. So you've got your bust dart here, strap, your centre front, empire line. And the skills that you've learnt in order to create this sample are how to sew bust darts, clipping and notching, and understitching. So most of you will use, if not all, some of these skills with your assessment.